Thank you for joining us. I'm George Jackson, Director of Events here at Government Executive Media Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, the role of real-time information in managing concurrent public safety emergencies, brought to you by Dataminer. Public safety emergencies don't take a break, and COVID-19 has added an additional layer of complexity for first responders and for public and private sector organizations. For now, every new disaster involves managing at least two emergencies, COVID-19 being the constant. During today's program, we'll discuss the explosion of publicly available data for disaster response, the risks posed by ignoring real-time data, plus how organizations can adapt to the evolving data landscape through proper planning, communication, and much more. But before we get started, I'd encourage our audience to ask our panel some questions today using the Q&A tab on your screen. We'll be fielding those about halfway through the program, but you should get them in there early. This webcast is being recorded. It'll be available after the fact for on-demand viewing. Now, let's begin. We've got a great lineup of panelists, including Josh Markman, Analytics Chief for the Office of Response and Recovery at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Chip Walker, he's co-lead of the Emergency Preparedness and Response Team at the Census Bureau. And Alex James, Chief Scientist and Senior Vice President of Artificial Intelligence at Dataminer. Before we get started with today's panel discussion, we have a brief presentation from Alex to set the stage for today's conversation. So, Alex, take it away.
Thank you. Oops. So thanks everyone for joining us. I think we're living in very exciting and interesting times. And so what I hope to do with this short presentation is mainly speak about AI. And so specifically the role of real-time information in managing emergencies in the public safety space. So some of you may know this photograph. Many of you probably don't. So I'll tell you a little story about what this is. So this was a fire that occurred a number of years ago. And there was a person named Philip Rickel who was a ticket collector. He was notified there was a burning tissue at the bottom of an escalator at a subway station. He went down, extinguished the flames, went back up to work, didn't think much of it. 15 minutes later, another passenger told another underground employee about some smoke coming out from an escalator. Again, he didn't think much of it. Later on, Christopher Hayes, who was the safety inspector at the time, was called. And there were other reports of smoke and flames by commuters and even a police officer. But nothing really happened because information was just flowing in different directions. At that point, Hayes, who was the inspector, went into the escalator machine room. He passed the sprinkler system, but it turned out he was not authorized to use it because it was controlled by a different department. So he really didn't do anything. He didn't see much more than just a little bit of smoke. Went back up. And then it turned out later on, a law enforcement officer contacted headquarters, had to walk up a long staircase outdoors where his radio actually worked. And he called the fire department to report a small fire at King's Cross. And so the fire department arrived almost 30 minutes after the initial reports of smoke and that initial tissue fire. So some of you may know what this is now because it's a pretty famous event. So this was the King's Cross fire in 1987 where 31 people died. Unfortunately, it's become famous both in terms of emergency response and also in terms of organizations and how communication flows within organizations. And I'll show you why it's relevant to today and the options that we have. So what failed in this particular event? Number one, there were various point-to-point communications, right? So there was a ticket collector, there were police officers, commuters telling different people, but it never really got to the right source. There was little or no interdepartmental communication. Again, different individuals just received the information, but they didn't communicate with each other. And then there was speed factor. Things moved fairly slowly, even though it was detected fairly early, at least 30 minutes earlier than the actual fire brigade arriving. And if we see what happens today, and this is an example from 2019 from one of my friends on Facebook, she posted this and she said, I found this huge duffel bag unattended. She called 911. She was transferred to the local station. The dispatcher said that's not their jurisdiction, directed her to the transportation authority. She was there for 10 minutes. No one showed up. She took the train and off she went. And in this particular case, nothing happened. But it's sort of the same scenario, right? Where somebody saw something, they notified who they thought was the right authority, and somehow that wasn't the right channel. It did nothing happened. Fortunately, nothing actually did happen in this case. But it's the same sort of scenario. So in that centralized model, what happens is you have a time component, and then you have the source of information, which is the dark blue dot on the left, and that one notifies somebody, and then that other node becomes like the hub that decides who to send it to. So there's a bit of a delay, and a decision has to be made as to where it's sent, and sometimes it doesn't go to the right place. And that's sort of what we have in the 911 systems. And just to be clear, I'm not discouraging anyone from calling 911. It's a fundamental part of what we need to do in emergencies. But there are some drawbacks to that sort of communication if it's the only one. Now, if you look at the broadcast model, specifically at social media and other forms of public data sources, communication spreads immediately. So there's a very big difference in terms of speed. When you post something on a social media platform and it's a public post, it's immediately received all over the world. So speed, right? It's immediate. And number two, scale. Everybody gets it. And the range, if you're calling the authorities, it's only within your jurisdiction. Where you're posting on social media, it's reaching the entire world. So the range in terms of geography, in terms of who gets it, in terms of the hierarchy or within an organization, can span everybody. So there's a pretty significant difference between those two. And for that reason, social media has become so critical in emergency response across all kinds of emergencies. And I won't read all of these, but you see some quotes from some figures in the emergency response phase. And there are some notable data bits here that are interesting. For example, during Hurricane Sandy, users sent more than 20 million tweets despite the loss of cell phone service at the peak of the storm. And this was in 2013. And of course, adoption of social media has increased since then. More people have access, not just in the United States, but all over the world, which is also pretty interesting. And some people have gone on to say that Twitter is now the first line of communication among government officials, considering coordinating responses that impact 911. So it's not only the community communicating with officials, but also officials with themselves, and it's an open system in that sense. And so in some ways, it's thrown out the old response playbook out the window. But one of the things that's most interesting and relevant for this conversation is that each disaster really, it's its own thing. It's its own very complex sequence of events, and there are cascades of events. And so each one is unique. And so because of that uniqueness, you need to be able to quickly get as much information as possible, because things that don't matter in one emergency and another one can become a big deal depending on what that is. And before I joined Dataminer, I didn't, unlike my fellow panelists who of course understand the complexity of so many different types of emergencies. For most people, when you think of large scale emergencies, you only think of a few things, right? Like most of us didn't really think of a pandemic as a big deal until it actually started happening, right? Like it wasn't on people's mind for many years. So here's a list of the many different types of emergencies. You see flu, fires, heat waves, wildfires. We hear about these a lot. Of course, tornadoes, tsunamis, power outage, poisonings, that's another one. So there are many different types of emergencies at scale. And then there are the smaller ones: traffic accidents, shootings, explosions, manhole explosions, falling trees, which, interestingly enough, if you put them in the context of a large emergency, can have huge impact. So a small traffic accident during an evacuation can create a backlog in that evacuation process that can be pretty significant. And then when we look at the number of emergencies just in the United States, it's pretty significant. We only hear about a few on the news, but they happen almost on a daily basis, and there are different types. So I want to bring that across. Just in terms of wildfires, this is an older chart, but you can see that it's millions and millions of acres that are burnt every year. So why are they so complicated? Unexpected events, speed, fragmented information. It comes from many different sources, geographic spread, not just the impact of the event, but where the information is coming from. When you think of a terrorist attack, for instance, it can have implications that go way beyond that specific location to an entire country, an entire world. It can change policy and so on and so forth. So it speaks about the geographic spread, and then the efficient deployment of resources depends a lot on that information that you have and the logistics. And so there's often what we can call causality of aftershocks, the things that cause other things to happen, and we've seen that very significantly with COVID, not just with shortage of toilet paper, but with a bunch of other things that have been happening around the world. So in terms of AI, why is it so relevant and such a critical tool for emergency response? On one hand, it can process extremely large amounts of heterogeneous data from all over the world in real time. So that's text in different formats, languages, images, video, audio, sensor data. It can integrate all of this data very, very quickly in ways that humans cannot possibly do. It can identify some very narrow classes of events fully automatically. It can rank some things as more important than others, and then it can deliver the right content to the right places at scale, right? So these are kind of the main things that it can do. And this is the core of what we do at DataMiner. I don't want the focus to be DataMiner because this is what AI does. But these are the hardest problems in AI, really. It's identifying the value of real-time information. And to really do this effectively, you need many, many different techniques, from deep learning to traditional machine learning, statistical techniques, natural language processing for processing only text, to computer vision, which takes as input images and video and is able to identify objects and events and images and video. And so how does a real-time platform like this work? Something like what we do at DataMiner, you basically have a bunch of public data sources that are coming in every second, every millisecond. We're getting thousands and thousands of these posts. And so a bunch of questions are answered by different models that are combined in very smart ways to make them computationally efficient and cost efficient, that determine, is it an event? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Is it new? Does it relate to other events? And is it real? And then once you do that, you determine who it goes to. And so these are kind of what we call the 6 W's: who, when, where, why, and how. And one is obviously not a W. So just as an example of some of the work that we've been doing at DataMiner with COVID-19, and I think this is still on our website, we put out some reports earlier this year. First of all, we detected the pandemic very early on December 30th, days before it was out in the news, and days before the CDC notified the public. And then since then, we've been following it very closely. And so we did some work in trying to predict clusters of potential growth increase back in January. And so we're very effective in doing that. And after the fact, we can look back and see the data and see that we did really well in detecting these clusters in the United States, in New York, in Florida. And when you look at this, it goes to what I was saying earlier. On one hand, you have these cascades of events. And if we look at the pandemic waves of 2018 and 19, this is what it looked like. There were 3 waves. The second one was the biggest one. And if we look what's happening today, and this chart is from just a couple of days ago, it's strikingly similar. And so what that tells us is that getting this real-time information and seeing what's happening in other countries, at least we found it to be super useful, because then we get a sense of what will happen next. So even though some of the events are happening far away from us, they're useful for us to plan and to understand, or for first responders and for emergency management, because they give you insights into what may happen next. What happened in Italy, happened in New York, and so on and so forth. And so we have sort of advanced warning. So that's one of the messages that I wanted to bring about. So back to AI technology to close my presentation. So the broadcast model is faster information to more people across organizational boundaries. It's distributed, which allows, specifically the current situation where many people are working from home. You can, do this in low bandwidth, where you get a lot of this information. So you can do more with fewer resources, better, more detailed information in real time, and preparing for the next waves and the unexpected. Again, what I said, what happens there will happen here eventually. So being aware of what's happening outside of your own area is really, really important, having that global coverage, which is something that AI is really, really good at doing, because it doesn't matter how big your team is. There's no way that humans alone can do this. So with this, I end, and we can go back to the panel. Thank you so much.
Alex, thank you. Great scene setter there. Just two quick housekeeping things for our viewing public on this. All of the panelists are going to be on mute unless they're talking. So for the panelists, I'm going to give you a heads up early. When a question is coming your way, just hit that unmute button. We just want a really great user experience for the folks at home. And just a reminder there, I think that Q&A portion of this event is really useful. You know, that's where the best questions come from. So go ahead and get on there, type something up for us. Chip, this first one is going to come to you. In addition to being the co-lead for Census's emergency preparedness and response team, you were also project lead for their COVID-19 interactive data hub. Tell us what that is and what that hub kind of taught you.
Yeah, sure, George. Thank you. So we've been working with FEMA and HHS and other federal agencies involved in emergency responses across the spectrum of different types. When COVID first started happening, we proactively reached out to HHS and said, we understand that these are certain risk factors that you may be interested in, and we can help you understand by geography what's happening with those risk factors. So in conversations, we were able to identify a number of different variables that HHS thought would be helpful in responding and understanding what was happening in COVID. And if you remember, in the beginning of COVID, one of the biggest risk factors was age. So we have a lot of demographic data on age. And first we were like, do you want 65 and over? And they were like, yeah, 65 and over is good, but we're really interested in like the really geriatric, so 80 or 85 and over. And we were able to help them break those variables down at a geographic level that they thought would be useful to them. In other interactions we had, another office within HHS was very interested in getting out information on COVID and how to stay safe, but not just in English. And so we were able to help them identify communities that had where they had a large percentage that didn't speak English well at home, and what the language was in that particular geographic area, so that materials could be produced and then sent there that weren't in English only. And this is something that Census does all the time because of the decennial census. We are continually producing non-English language materials so that everyone can get the information that's needed. Subsequently, we thought that this information would be useful to the public as well as other federal and state and local agencies. And so we decided to create the Census Bureau's COVID-19 Interactive Data Hub, working with Esri. In just about 2.5, 3 weeks, we stood up this hub, at least version 1.0, and released it, which had a number of these variables available in a dashboard that you were able to filter on. And not only that, we were able to include some of our economic data. People frequently think of the census as producing demographic data, but we also are one of the largest distributors of economic data on the economy and businesses. And so we were able to add this into the hub. Now, as we're about to release version 1.5 of the hub, we're looking at over 400 variables that we believe are COVID related, including a number of the surveys that were started specifically for COVID by the Census Bureau, including the weekly household pulse, the small business pulse, business formations statistics. And these were weekly surveys stood up very quickly to provide what you were kind of saying about real time, or as close to real time as we can get, so that people can look at the effects and the interactions regarding COVID.
That's great. More on the real time later, just a tease for later on in our program here. Josh, this next one's coming to you. Talk a little bit about FEMA, what kind of data sets you have for response and recovery efforts, and which ones of those, I'm sure it's many, you find most useful.
Great, thanks, George. Yep, as you can imagine, this year and in several of the past years, FEMA has been quite busy in disaster response and recovery work. And it's sort of the name of the game to start is collaboration and coordination. And that's often person to person, but increasingly it is that sort of identification and accumulation of data sets. And so it's been a sort of a key facet for FEMA to bring partners from across the federal interagency physically together to share information and data. Of course, that's been a little bit of challenge in this COVID environment. But we have also sort of made inroads in sort of bringing in private sector information, sort of also inroads in sort of social listening and crowdsourced information. But in terms of sort of the response and recovery data posture, I mean, assuming that we know the event is coming, let's say a hurricane, where we often have at least a few days warning, we're trying to first collect data on where is the sort of the typical storm path, where is it projected? There's of course uncertainty in that, but trying to figure out and recalibrate as we can to figure out what are the communities that are sort of most at risk. Then we'll sort of want to put in data about those communities. What sort of vulnerabilities or sort of capability gaps might we know already exist there? Which of these communities might be recovering from a previous disaster, either that year or in the past couple of years? We'll sort of build models around storm surge and flooding. We'll sort of pull together data on what are the resources, the logistics elements, what commodities do we have nearby, and where do we sort of need to backfill based on the anticipated need. We might pull in data from census and others to try to understand those vulnerabilities in the communities that help script what commodities we might need to push in that direction. We'll pull in data to help sort of assess what is the sort of the likely evacuation posture that communities might need, where the place is most likely to have evacuation warnings. That might then frame where we sort of move our urban search and rescue components, but it also will help script for us where might we need shelters, where might we need extra food and water, depending on where people are going to be. In terms of recovery, obviously we're tracking the individuals in the communities that receive assistance from FEMA, but we also want to understand what is the impact of our work. So we're trying to sort of drive to more successful outcomes in terms of recovery. So we're also looking to pull in data around sort of individuals and community to see how are they recovering from these disasters as survivors in the weeks and months and years after the event takes place.
That's great. I'm going to jump around a bit here. I do want to get back to kind of COVID-19 being layered on top of this, but Alex, I'm going to pivot to you next because Josh referenced something there that I think is really interesting, and I love your kind of across government view. You know, you work with a bunch of different agencies. He mentioned that FEMA pulls in data from census and many others. You know, has that level of communication improved in recent history? Do you feel like that's easier for agencies to do today than maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago?
I think it's still a challenge. You know, I would let Josh speak more about FEMA and you know how it works at FEMA. But in my experience, of course, it's easier for people to pull the data across government and industry because a lot of this data is public. But then the challenge is, how do you effectively integrate it? How do you find what's relevant and what's not? And that's hard. And that's where companies like Dataminr come in to help you make sense of that data, because the problem is not so much whether it's there or not, it's that it's too much of it. And you know, you need technical capability that is very significant to be able to really identify what's important and what's not, especially in a real-time scenario. So I think there are many opportunities, and there's definitely a lot of data out there that can be useful. But I think for most organizations, it's still a challenge, and I would include both private and government organizations and non-for-profits in that bucket. You really need specialized skills to have the tools to do that.
Coming back to COVID-19, you know, the answer may be somewhat obvious here, but Josh, I'd like to start with you on this one. What has 2020 looked like from FEMA's perspective? regarding public safety, emergency management. What are sort of some of your biggest efforts, challenges that you faced?
Yeah, it's been quite a year for sure. We sort of started off with an earthquake in Puerto Rico right as we changed calendars, and then of course COVID was quickly came behind that, and then we've had this historic hurricane season, not to mention wildfires that are going on in the West and Midwest, and ice storms and tornadoes thrown in as well. So just the quantity, of course, has been a challenge and would have been a challenge in any year. And then COVID presented some of these unique challenges. As I mentioned, a lot of the work FEMA does is person to person, whether it's in our response center or on the ground, meeting with survivors, registering for them with assistance, co-locating in emergency operations centers. So just the infrastructure with which we usually engage, we've had to think about new ways of communicating. So some of it is, adopting new technologies for communication. So leaning more into some of the virtual communications, whether it's the WebEx platform we're on or Microsoft Teams or Zoom that everyone's is working with, but also developing new strategies. So we typically have to inspect homes after a disaster to sort of assess the damage. And we've been working with new ways to virtually inspect those homes so that we can both cut down the waiting time for survivors, but also do it in a posture that is safer for our FEMA personnel and the survivors themselves, removing that human contact. We've had to do a lot of the operations virtually, like I mentioned. And while it's been a challenge, I also while I have the floor, want to note some of the opportunity, at least from where I've been sitting during our COVID response, working on a data analytics task force that was stood up between FEMA and HHS. It was remarkable the amount of data that was coming in and the granularity in terms of some of the hospitalization and testing information just coming from states and individual hospitals and pulling in that data. And of course, it was a challenge. We didn't really have the infrastructure set up to do that very sort of easily from the scratch, but mobilized an entire federal, state, and local force to try to get that done. And the amount of information that we're pulling in to try to help inform decision making was something I had just not seen before. And so obviously sort of necessity is the mother of invention. And so showing that we could do this and the value of this and potentially the future need for this, hopefully those lines of data sharing and communication, and as Alex mentioned, the ways that we can process it faster and smarter, hopefully sort of open up a whole new set of opportunities once some of these hazards and risks sort of tend to fade away and we get a little bit more control over all of the different hazards that 2020 has thrown towards us.
Let's stay on that culture of innovation here for a little bit longer. Chip, I'm going to come to you next. Josh referenced, virtual home inspections and other things that I think without COVID-19, we wouldn't be taking a look at a lot of this. The federal workforce moves largely remote. I think it's been a great year to really just sort of try things out with minimal risk, new innovations. I think the census itself, the mobility aspects and the way that you guys use data was already kind of a pre-existing innovation. But do you have any other examples inside census that you could sort of dovetail off of Josh here? What has sort of COVID-19 resulted in from a silver lining perspective at the agency?
Well, a number of things. I mean, there's never a good time for something like COVID-19. However, it really happened at a particularly bad time for the Census Bureau because we were going to be conducting the 2020 census. Now, it wouldn't have a dramatic impact on the self-response. So when you go online and you self-respond, that's the easiest and most efficient, the most taxpayer-friendly way for people to respond to the census. But we know that we're going to have to, at some point, send hundreds of thousands of enumerators out in the field to knock on doors. And we were going to have to do this during COVID. And so we, in some innovative ways, we had a group that we call the Fusion Center. And the Fusion Center would look at data, including data from HHS and CDC on COVID, to understand the landscape in which the enumerators would be going out and knocking on doors. Not only are we concerned for the safety of our own employees, but we're concerned about the public's perception of whether they should be opening up the doors to answer questions. And so we were able to follow COVID and to look at counties that were very high risk versus counties or geographies that were low risk, to kind of understand when we could go in the field in certain areas. But we also had other things that we needed to follow that could interrupt our field operations. And so that would include hurricanes, of course. So not only did we have COVID, but we've had this record-breaking hurricane season, which today, Hurricane Zeta is going to impact the southeastern coast of Louisiana. So Zeta is going to be the 27th named storm, and we're not out of hurricane season yet. And so all of these things, we have to be prepared on what kind of impact it may have on our field operations. And we've had offices closed because of hurricanes and floods, because of wildfires and air quality, because of civil unrest. So we've had a number of different impacts, and we had to be able to adapt and to understand and to predict when, where, and when these things might happen.
Alex, let's have you jump in there, because you mentioned during your presentation, and I teased earlier, this idea of real-time information. What does that lend to this sort of emergency management situation?
Well, I mean, I think depending on the type of emergency, but in general, I would say, and Josh and Chip can comment on this, in any kind of emergency, the earlier that you know, the better, because the more that you can prepare, and the more complex that the emergency situation is, the more that having real-time access to information, it makes a big difference, because it allows you to shift resources. One of the things that I think is common across all of these large-scale emergencies is that the information comes in fragmented, and as time goes by, we learn more and more. It's like putting a puzzle together, and we start to learn, as Chip was saying in the census case, what is the impact of this? What is the impact of that? So speed is really important, because the faster that you can put all that together, the faster that you can decide what steps to take next, and what part of your plan needs to be modified and adapted to the new situation. There may be, one single bit of information might completely dismantle your plan, and you might have to change it so significantly. And so if you don't get it in time, everything that you had planned might kind of fall apart.
I'm going to put that to both Josh and Chip. Josh, I'll start with you. It sounds like you're doing some real-time work right now, but what's the next phase? What challenges are you facing? Where could you, use help from industry? Take that any way you'd like here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, this sort of being a team effort across the federal interagency helps with the sort of expertise and the nuance in each of the individual data sets, which is obviously important when you're trying to generate new insights, is to know what the data are telling you. And that's a lot for any group to sort of take on, but thankfully we can sort of decentralize that with our partners. But then the challenge is the sort of understanding what we could do or should do in a more sort of surgical manner, I think, is much like Alex said, it's that integration of them. When you're pulling in data from multiple agencies or multiple modes, what is it telling you? And that, you have to have a centralization point somewhere. And so that's a place where it can both be sort of overwhelming and sort of just a lot to sort of process at once. In those regards, I think, both in terms of the data itself and then in this work, we have to make the investment when we're more in a steady state environment. If you're trying to build this in the throes of a response, the way a lot of us have for COVID, with sheer will and brute force, you can still generate a lot of insights and innovations. But understanding what are the appropriate baselines, like understanding that data before before a hurricane makes landfall, what were the number of customers without power, or what were some of the storm systems, what was their capacity before the hurricane hit, so we understand what was the impact of the hurricane, sort of what is some of the vulnerability or fragility of those communities. You need to understand that beforehand to really help not only just with your planning, but then the immediate response. And so I think the biggest thing is, yes, is trying to do this integration. I think that's still a place for growth for FEMA and for others, like Alex mentioned. And I think it's just knowing that this is, a 365 job. It's not just what are the insights that we can draw when we're in response or we're transitioning to recovery, but a lot of the success we're going to have is that investment that we make in a little bit of more of those calmer times, so that we're prepared to execute and know what we're looking for and know what we're going to do with some of the scenario planning, because we've done a bit of the work up front as well.
So, Chip, Josh used the word centralization. I'm going to use a synonym there of hub. You've already kind of built this before. What would your advice be to sort of those agency leaders who are looking to do something like this for the first time? What steps would you advise them to avoid around that? And if you give this a real-time data analysis lens to it, bonus points to you, sir.
A couple of things. So I think number one is to understand who your audience is. We have audiences that are across the spectrum. We have really advanced users who are advanced data users. They may be data scientists. They may be professional data users like FEMA and HHS, and we can supply them files and they can do a lot of the file breakdown that they need to do. But then we also have a very large public sort of average user, maybe not of a lot of experience in combining data sets and things of that nature. So we try to create a number of different data tools that make it very easy for just the average Joe to go to census.gov and find what it is that they're looking for. So in the hub, we tried to do a combination of the two. We tried to make it so that more advanced users, state and local government users and others, GIS users, could come in and analyze the data. But we also try to provide very easy access to some very basic numbers on what the potential impacts of COVID could be, not only on the demographic community, but on the economic community and businesses as well, because we all know that there was a tremendous amount of impact and still is to this day on our economy and on businesses. And so we try to not think of our audience as just being one or the other. We try to create a wide range of tools from the sophisticated to the novice, so they can get the data that is most useful to them. And then we also try and work with our federal partners and anyone that wants to offer up advice on what types of data would be most useful to them. And so we have tools. I think Alex showed a screenshot earlier of On the Map for Emergency Management. And that's an automated tool that allows you to go in and see all the current disasters that are going on in the United States today. You can click on those and you can get various information. We have other tools like Census Business Builder that can allow a user to go in and build their own customized region. That's something that we've known for years that people wanted to do. They wanted to go in and they wanted to look at 6 different counties, not all the counties in a particular state, or 6 different counties and 5 zip codes across a region. If you look at the impacts of a disaster, it's not neat and clean. It's not all the counties in a state. It's some of the counties and maybe a few of the counties in another state. And so we've tried to create tools that allow the user to do what they would ask you if they were talking to you on the telephone.
Just a reminder to our audience at home, if you want to get a question to these leaders in the nation's response to disaster and emergencies, data-wise, just shoot us a note. That's right there on your screen. Alex, next one coming to you. What are some of the tripping points with data that you've seen that folks should be aware of?
Oh, there are many. It really depends on where in the pipeline you want to look at. So, if you're building this sort of capability within your organization, clearly having the infrastructure to store the data, to put it in the right places, having the technical know-how, hiring data scientists, and what does it mean to have a data scientist, because there are different levels and types of data scientists. At Data Miner, we have a team of PhDs in natural language processing, computer vision, deep learning, but not everybody needs, a team that is so specialized. It depends on what it is that you're doing. So that's in terms of the team. And, I think both Josh and Chip talked about this a little bit. Look at the data sources, have clear use cases. Who are the users of your data? How will they use it? I think that's important. What is the business use case if it's a company, but it's the same in government? How exactly will it be used? Who will benefit? And then based on that, you kind of analyze, what are the tools that are there that you can use, and what are the right data sources? And is the data giving you what you need, right? Like our focus is event detection. That's basically what we do. It's pretty straightforward. And so for us, any data source where we can find events is useful. So that includes sensor data, web, social media, and so on and so forth. But that may not be the case for someone else, where they need more context, and the focus is less on real time and more on sort of what I would call maybe a batch kind of analysis, where you want to get more insights into the context. What are the resources available at a certain location? And then I think the key is combining those two often, right? Like we focus on the real time, but that doesn't mean our customers don't have a lot of experience and data and information on the context to take that real time signal and make it to good use depending on what it is that they do. And so there are many angles to look at, and I think the thing that's exciting is, as we discussed earlier, there are many opportunities to get some of this data, and the world is becoming increasingly digitized. So there's a lot of room for growth in this space, both in emergency response and planning.
First question in, and I'm just going to kind of go out of order. I have plenty more here, but I want to make sure, because I think this is a good one, and it's something that we missed around the state of practice, tracking, and redeploying, with the supply chain. So Josh, these supply chain questions, what should our audience kind of know about supply chain considerations that you sort of have to work with inside of FEMA?
Yeah, so for a lot of the typical commodities that survivors and communities might need, the way to sort of rapidly deploy them is FEMA has a number of them on hand in distribution centers across the country. But of course, in large scale events and things like COVID, it's often that the need is just going to outpace the supply. So we've established a National Business Emergency Operations Center and cross-sector business and infrastructure partnerships between the federal government, where FEMA helps co-lead, and the private sector to help identify where are those needs and then how do we source them. Of course, the supply chain itself can also be at risk during these hazards. And so it's identifying what are the disruptions to the supply chain, where are those needs, and how do we move resources to reestablishing the supply chain so that what industry and business and industry can source sort of more organically, if it wasn't disrupted, that could be the posture. And so again, it's part of communication and planning. It's understanding what the vulnerabilities in the supply chain are and pay attention to them, and then getting that real-time information to understanding are supplies flowing as we expect, as they normally do, or are those disruptions, and what are some of the cascading impacts. And so the partnership with the private sector, I think, is sort of, again, it's part of growth, but I think it's a win over the last few years, having those partnerships with businesses, hundreds of them that are both interested in being a part of the solution and information sharing, because they understand the important role that they play in helping communities stabilize. And so, I mean, we're still in a place where people and supplies matter, and everybody is being affected by things, especially like COVID. So it's really just having the pulse that what is the current situation on those supplies, and then sort of troubleshooting as they come up to try to bring the supply chain and any other of those disruptions back to a more stable state.
Josh, I want to stay with you just for a second, if I could here. Alex earlier used the term business use case, and you have to have conversations with your leadership all the time. And I am guessing sometimes you have to kind of make a business case for sort of the use of data, the way that you respond. Any sort of useful tips to our audience in those types of conversations, your sort of best communication methods with those business leaders of the organization? And I guess the root of my question here is, for real-time breaking news alerts, is there a time where they sort of could have improved response time, if necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as sort of Alex mentioned, that sort of a posture of broadcast is something that can just get information in the hands of folks who, in faster than we've ever seen and at scale that we've never seen before. That is a place where, we're using and integrating more. I think it's that sort of balance between wanting to be fast, but also wanting to be right. And sometimes, you know that because there's some of that immediacy, because sometimes there's not always that sort of fact checking and validation, that we also need to sort of think about, is this actual actionable information? And so how do we sort of cross that line between the benefits of being able to move faster against the risks of it sort of being a false positive or a false alarm? And so part of it, I think, is just making some of those inroads, and that maybe it's not necessarily the real-time information that is sort of the use case that you start with. It's how do you start people slowly and say, for this decision, let's see, let's have it as just part of the conversation and help it try to inform your sort of thought space. And when you're trying to articulate the decision in front of you, let's see sort of how you can sort of think about it from this, more data informed lens. And as you start getting some of that buy-in, you can start pushing the envelope a little bit more, whether it's more sophisticated data or some of these sort of more real-time information data sets. So I think it's sort of leaning on your successes, sort of showing this is we've been working towards this moment over the course of weeks and months and years as we've matured as an analytic agency. I think also just looking to other places that have been successful of it and say, the reason this group was able to move so quickly was because they leveraged this technology, this data source that no one's ever used before. Here are the opportunities that we might be able to use this source or a similar source in the work that we're doing. And then even if it's just sort of on a pilot aspect, let's start small, show some successful returns, and then build on that and expand into sort of, whether it's a new problem set like a full-scale response, or some other sort of factor. But I think building on your past successes and then borrowing from the successes from others probably is a great place to start, and where I've seen some successes on the FEMA side.
We're starting to get close to the end of the hour here, and I want to make sure, Alex, that I get in this next question to you. Chip, I promise we haven't forgotten about you over there. But Alex, I want you to put on your artificial intelligence hat for a moment, play futurist for us. Where are agencies right now regarding plugging AI into this area, this sort of emergency response area, and where do you think they'll be in the future?
That's a hard question. I think it depends a lot on the agency. I think there's been a lot of really great work done at agencies like FEMA and as Chip mentioned, in the Census Bureau. And I see governments working harder on integrating data, making data public, but we do have a long way to go. And part of it is the human structures within these organizations, the training, the different hierarchies and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, there's the technical capabilities, which, as we know, at least in AI, there's a shortage of talent, and it is harder, I think, for government to hire people with the AI expertise that may be needed in some cases. And as I said earlier, it's not always needed. But I think the future is bright, and I think the way that I've seen it, at least in the United States, that partnership between government and the private sector has worked fairly well in many cases, and I think that's sort of what I see continuing in the future, because the more that the government agencies partner with the private sector, I think that knowledge of how to do things kind of transfers to the government, and it helps up-level both, because the government is really good at certain things and the private sector is good at other things. And so that communication and that joint work kind of helps solve the problems, because emergency response is super, super complex, and we need everyone's help to really be able to respond properly.
Some of our viewers for this webinar are state and local. They're not necessarily really interested in the sort of federal side of the equation here. So Chip, this next one is coming to you. Data sources, if you're looking at those from a state and local level, what should sort of local response organizations be looking for out of what census puts out there? What do you think is most useful to them? How do you like to navigate those relationships between federal and state and local?
Sure, that's a really excellent question. One thing, for example, we recently working with fire. We can't work with individual fire departments. On our level in helping them identify those at-risk populations within a particular area. So if you're a fire department, you're going to want to know what is the percent elderly, what is the percent disabled, what is the percent that may not speak English well at home. You may want to know if there's a major emergency, what part of your population is 5 and under. So there's all these risk factors that have already been identified by fire departments, by CDC, by emergency planners, by FEMA, that make this particular population extremely vulnerable. And we can provide that information to those state and local governments and to fire departments or emergency management agencies. And so we try and make that information as possible. Now, as I mentioned, data tools down pilot. We don't have time to train them. They don't have time to take the training. So we have an emergency management page. And so, for example, right now, if you were to go to census.gov, right at the very top of the page, you're going to see a banner that says Hurricane Zeta. And you click on that, and we've already done the work for everyone. We've already gone in and we've produced reports that'll show you the breakdown in those communities that are likely to be impacted by this hurricane. So we try and do the work for people because we know they don't have time. And as Josh was saying earlier, when things slow down, then we provide the training so that they can do it themselves.
Josh, going back to you, and this might be building off of the supply chain question, it might not, but what does FEMA need most to really improve response times going forward? COVID revealed some sort of infrastructure weaknesses out there, particularly around supply chain, and everybody was stretched pretty thin. You referenced earlier, dealing with multiple emergencies all at the same time, these layered right on top of one another. Like, what do you need going forward to just sort of help the agency speed all that up?
Yeah, and I think, we've decided as an agency to try to take a little bit more of an aggressive posture and to be more prepared and have, staging a little bit closer and then personnel moving a little bit faster than normal, especially for an event that we would know about like a hurricane. So for example, Louisiana already has an emergency declaration, and we have millions of meals and liters of water sort of already staged just outside of where we think the potentially impacted areas are going to be. And so part of that is just experience to try to say, hey, we want to be a little bit more aggressive in that posture. In terms of the sort of more information to inform where we go, I think a huge benefit, and again, we've only been scratching the surface, is pulling in a lot of that public information. So I wanted to make sure I pointed out that FEMA has an ArcGIS geo platform, both where, like Chip mentioned, we push out information and dashboards and things where folks can look at the geographies of their interest, but that we also are recipients of the data and different layers of information that states, regions are making available to us. And so by getting more of that information, we can obviously move more quickly. I guess I also have to say that, of course, FEMA sort of, its posture is for disasters to be state managed and locally executed and federally supported. And so we really are stepping in when the capabilities of the states are overwhelmed. And so it's always that sort of conversation back and forth with states to understand that we don't want to overstep our sort of authorities and our role in sort of a state managed response. And so I imagine that can at times, especially when folks are in the throes of a disaster, be seen as sort of FEMA not moving quickly enough, but it's also a matter of understanding where are we putting the most effective resources in the most effective places. And that's sometimes it's, leaning into one location a little bit more than another based on what we, again, from the data suggests that those locations need our support more than others, at least at that time. And then, of course, as the dynamics change, so will our response.
Alex, as we wrap, I want to give you the final word here. You mentioned communication in your presentation to kick things off. I think both Chip and Josh have talked about that internal communication with their leadership inside agencies, their communication with other federal agencies. Talk a little bit about the industry government communication aspect and maybe where you wish federal agencies communicated better with you.
I think, as I said earlier, I think the key is viewing many of these engagements as partnerships where that communication is two ways, because the more that the private sector understands the use cases, the better the solutions that they can develop, and vice versa. The more that the government agencies understand what the private sector is developing, the better use that they can make of those technologies. And one thing that's interesting about our current times is that we're all users of technology, whether we're in the public or the private sector. We all have cell phones. We all do all of this stuff, and so that makes it very interesting because we're used to a lot of this. Whereas many years ago that was not the case. You would only access technology in whatever role you were in, not in your daily life. And so I think the understanding of technology has increased across everyone in that sense. If that makes sense to you.
It does. Josh, Chip, Alex, I just want to thank you all for being here. That hour just flew by. Audience, we've reached the end of our program. I thank you for tuning in, and a final thanks to Data Miner for making today's event possible. Just a reminder, we recorded this webcast and we'll send it to you by the end of the week. We all get a lot of emails, so check your inbox, share it with your colleagues, get it out there. I think it's just great material. For Government Executive Media Group, I'm George Jackson.